Have you ever tried to fit an entire life into the space of just a few minutes? One short speech, even one conversation. Something that happens sometimes at those momentous points in life, times when we know that everything is changing. As pastors, Monica and I sometimes have to do that at funerals. We're asked to tell the story of a loved one, to turn a family's memories into a picture that they will recognize. But it's not just at funerals that this happens. Cynthia and I had to do something very similar before Kyle and Sarah's wedding as we were writing our speech. We had to find a way to put Kyle's life into words. His life and everything that we felt for him and about this wonderful young lady that he was marrying. It's not easy. But sometimes we do have to fit an entire lifetime into just one conversation. And that's the way in which I've come to see Mary's conversation with Gabriel. God fits a whole lifetime of discipleship into the space of this one conversation. In this one encounter, Mary experiences just about everything that a life of learning to live with God and for God looks like. To put it another way, if you and I are disciples of Jesus, we are likely to find that what happens to Mary in this life-changing conversation is something that also happens to us, and possibly again and again. The conversation begins as a relationship with God always begins, with God taking the initiative. The angel Gabriel was sent by God. Now, you might be inclined to say, hey, I have never had an angel visit me. And you might even want to say, I really feel like my relationship with God began with me seeking Him. Began with questions that I needed to have answered. It began with a need that I needed to have filled. You might even have a wonderful, even powerful story about how all of that brought you to faith or even brought you here. But none of that alters the fact that God has been speaking to you, reaching out to you for your entire life. For instance, Psalm 19 tells us that every single night the heavens are telling the glory of God. God put them there to speak to you, to proclaim what Paul calls God's eternal power and divine nature. And even more than that, God wrote to you. Wrote to you thousands of years before you were even born. Through prophets and apostles, the silent speech of the heavens became a written word that you and I could hold. The most read word, the best-selling word that this world has ever known. And even more than that, that incredible word from God became flesh for us. Again, before we were ever born, God was making a way for us to know Him, to find Him, to be reconciled to Him, all through Jesus. Just as it was for Mary, so it is for us. God takes the initiative. In fact, He's speaking to us right now. But what happens when you and I first realize that God, the living God, the only true God, is speaking to us? Sometimes we're grateful. For a lot of people, though, that realization is quite simply overwhelming. They simply don't know what to do with it. And we see that in Mary as well. In what I think is one of the greatest understatements in history, Luke tells us that when the angel spoke to her, Mary was much perplexed and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Now, I call that an understatement, not because of anything that Mary says, but because of Gabriel's immediate response to Mary's perplexitude. Do not be afraid. In what I think is also a bit of an understatement, James Martin puts it this way: fear is a common reaction to the divine. Now, fear may not be the way that you or I would characterize our own reaction to God, but that is likely a product of how long we've actually known God. But that was certainly not the case for John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace. Writing about his own first encounter with God, Newton would write, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear." Of course, he would also go on to write, "And grace my fears relieved." But fear, even panic, was Newton's initial reaction to the approach of God. C.S. Lewis was much the same. He writes, "Amiable agnostics will talk cheerfully about man's search for God. To me, as I then was, they might as well have talked about the mouse's search for the cat. I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. You must picture me alone in that room, night after night, feeling the steady, unrelenting approach of him I so earnestly desired not to meet." As Lewis says so well, the fear of God for many people is the fear of being interfered with, the fear of losing control, which is why we now live in a culture of amiable agnostics, a culture that for the most part does not want to face the reality of facing God. But we not only need to hear Mary's trepidation, we also need to hear Gabriel's response. Do not be afraid. Because those are words that Mary's son would speak often. Because often Our fear is the greatest barrier there is to discipleship. Fear of what others might think if we were to take God seriously. Fear of the loss of control or security or comfort if we were to let God in. Because putting God in charge can be a terrifying thing. But we need to remember that the one who calls us to set our fears aside is also the one who said that he had come that we might experience life in all of its fullness. The one who came in response to the love of God for a world that is perishing. What it comes down to is that in the end, no one will ever regret letting God be God. Now, after the shock of discovering that God wants to be involved in our lives, the next question is typically how. We want some details. And Mary is much the same. Mary doesn't need to know much, but she does need to know something. How can this be? And you and I may wonder how God could hope to accomplish anything meaningful through us. We look at what we ourselves might bring to God's plans, and it would be perfectly natural for us to come away unimpressed. But to Mary's question, the angel replies with what you and I so often need to hear: that nothing is impossible with God. And the angel makes it specific by talking about Mary's relative Elizabeth. Thought to be barren, Elizabeth was already 6 months pregnant. Essentially, God's message to Mary was, if you have any doubts at all about what I can do, look at what I've already done. In other words, looking backward helps Mary to look forward. And doing the same thing can make a huge difference for us. For his book, The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel interviewed a number of experts, including Gary Habermas, PhD from Michigan State, Doctor of Divinity from Oxford, author of 7 books on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And most of that interview presents Habermas's detailed, carefully developed arguments for the historicity of the resurrection. But at the end of the interview, Strobel asks Habermas about the importance of the resurrection. And at that point, the scholar steps aside and the man of faith appears. And he begins to talk about his wife, Debbie, who had died of stomach cancer in 1995. He says, I sat on our porch. My wife was upstairs dying. Except for a few weeks, she was home through it all. It was an awful time. As I would sit there, I'd picture Job, who went through all this terrible stuff and asked questions of God, but then God turned the tables and asked Job a few questions. I knew that if God were to come to me, I'd ask only one question. Lord, why is Debbie up there in bed? And I think God would respond by asking gently, Gary, did I raise my son from the dead? And I'd say, come on, Lord, I've written 7 books on that topic. Of course he was raised from the dead. But I want to know about Debbie. I think he'd keep coming back to the same question. Did I raise my son from the dead? Did I raise my son from the dead? Until I got his point. The resurrection says that if Jesus was raised 2,000 years ago, there is an answer for Debbie's death in 1995. And you know what? It worked for me while I was sitting on the porch, and it still works today. God's message for Gary Habermas was the same message God had for Mary. If you have any doubts about what I can do, look at what I've already done. That is why it is so important that we stay connected to the Word, that we are in the Word, that we are reading the Word. Because it is by looking back at what God has already done that we are enabled to look forward to what God might yet do in us and through us and for us. And then, of course, Mary says yes. And that yes has been the subject of countless sermons all by itself. How does one say yes to that kind of drastic and dramatic interference, as C.S. Lewis would put it, in one's life? How does one say yes to that kind of disruption to our plans? How does one say yes to the loss of so much control? That is the fundamental question of discipleship. How do we say yes? Can we say yes? Because saying yes to God is where a life of discipleship begins. Mary said yes, and so must we. To be a member of the church is to be someone who has said yes. That is why membership is marked by a public declaration that we are for Jesus. We say yes to his lordship. We say yes to putting him in charge. And discipleship is a daily yes, a daily surrender of control, a daily welcoming of God's interference in our lives. And this season before Christmas is a wonderful time for us to renew our yes, to once again invite Jesus to be born in us today, to open ourselves up to all that God wants to do in us and through us and for us. And I could end the sermon there, but there is one more part to this conversation, one more fact that we need to consider. Then the angel departed from her. As hard as it might be to imagine the feelings associated with having conversation with angels, I find it just as hard to imagine what Mary must have felt at that moment when suddenly she found herself alone once again. Alone with her yes. And with whatever that was going to mean for her. Alone with the consequences of her choice for God. Alone, perhaps even wondering whether any of it had really happened. And then the angel departed from her. That is when Mary really lived out her faith. It is so much easier to say yes with an angel right there in front of you. It is so much easier to say yes when you are surrounded by 100 other believers. It is so much easier to say yes in the midst of a season of light and hope and magic and promise. But when the angel leaves, when Monday morning arrives, when January and February finally roll around, how much harder is it to say yes then? Again, as James Martin puts it, Mary lived long enough to see her son perform wondrous deeds. And she also would have been witness to him after the resurrection. Yet in those intervening years, when Jesus was an infant, then a child, then an adolescent, she may have asked the same questions that believers ask today. Did that really happen? Was that really God? How can I believe? In time, on Easter Sunday, Mary received the ultimate answer. In time, so will we. But first comes trust. The trust that follows the departure of the angel. The trust that carries our yes into tomorrow and into all the days that lie ahead. Amen.